As Canada hopes for relief on steel and aluminum tariffs, U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick is reportedly rejecting any possibility of a deal on the auto sector. Lutnick says there will be no free trade deal without tariffs, that Canada should accept being second to the U.S. on autos, and that cars will be assembled in the United States, not in Canada.
In Toronto, a routine trade conference turned into a political earthquake. As Canadian officials gathered to discuss tariffs, U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick delivered a message that stunned the room. He ruled out any special deal on the auto sector and made his stance clear: America first, Canada second. Cars, he said, would be built in the United States, not in Canada. That blunt message immediately reached Ontario, the beating heart of Canada's auto industry. Premier Doug Ford fired back, warning that if Washington intended to cripple Canada's steel, aluminum, and auto sectors, Ontario would stop sending even a single ounce of energy south. His tone was fierce, but it reflected a deep frustration that had been building for months. This confrontation was about more than tariffs or car assembly lines. It was about the future of a continent's industrial balance. For years, North America's prosperity has depended on a tightly linked supply chain stretching from Detroit to Windsor, from Ohio to Ontario. The Trump administration's latest push to repatriate auto manufacturing now threatens to unravel that system, and in doing so, it could end up harming the very U.S. industries it claims to protect. Since returning to the White House, President Donald Trump has doubled down on his no free trade without tariff strategy. His team, led by Secretary Lutnick, argues that Canada must accept a subordinate role in North American manufacturing. Under this logic, the U.S. would dominate car production while Canada provides raw materials and components. In Washington's view, this hierarchy is simple economics. The United States is the larger market, with more capital and leverage. But in practice, the two economies are deeply interdependent. Ontario's auto sector alone employs over 100,000 people and supports another 400,000 across supply chains that cross the border daily. Thousands of trucks shuttle parts back and forth, feeding assembly lines that have operated as one integrated ecosystem for decades. By imposing tariffs and discouraging investment in Canadian facilities, Washington hopes to force automakers to relocate production to the U.S. But the reality is more complicated. The components used in an SUV built in Michigan often originate from factories in Ontario and vice versa. If that chain is disrupted, both sides lose efficiency and face higher costs. Trump's team believes tariffs are leverage, yet history shows they often become self-inflicted wounds. The more pressure Washington applies, the more friction it introduces into a system that underpins its own manufacturing base.
I will put legislation in if he wants to destroy our auto sector and destroy our steel sector, and for Quebec, the aluminum sector. There won't be a grain of critical minerals going south of the border. There won't be one ounce of energy coming from Ontario, because you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to use that cheap energy that we're selling to our American friends to be competitive to sell products around the world. That's what we're going to do.
Ontario's response came quickly and sharply. Premier Ford's statement about withholding energy and critical minerals was more than political theater. It was a reminder that Canada holds powerful cards of its own. Ontario supplies significant electricity to neighboring U.S. states, and Canada as a whole provides more than half of America's imported energy, from hydroelectric power to oil, natural gas, and uranium. By linking energy to trade, Ford reframed the conversation. He wasn't threatening out of anger, he was signaling that Canada could recalibrate its exports to serve global markets instead of feeding an unbalanced partnership. He emphasized that the same cheap energy currently powering Ontario's factories could make Canadian goods more competitive abroad if the U.S. chose confrontation over cooperation. Within Canada's industrial community, the reaction was equally strong. Business leaders warned that cutting Canada out of North American auto manufacturing would backfire on American companies. Many of the plants at risk are owned by U.S. giants like General Motors and Ford, which have operated profitably in Canada for more than a century. Closing those facilities would mean spending billions to relocate production and losing access to an integrated supply chain that includes Canadian steel, aluminum, and advanced plastics. Meanwhile, labor unions voiced anger that Ottawa seemed to prioritize steel and aluminum relief over autos. For them, the message was clear: the auto sector must remain at the center of any negotiation. Canada cannot trade away its core industries for symbolic wins elsewhere. In this atmosphere, the once predictable rhythm of North American manufacturing is giving way to a new reality. Ontario, long seen as dependent on U.S. trade goodwill, is asserting itself as an indispensable partner, one capable of influencing not just what gets built, but where and how power flows across the continent. While the Trump administration insists its tariffs protect American jobs, the economic math tells a different story. Disrupting trade with Canada carries significant costs for the U.S. economy. Each year, more than $100 billion worth of auto parts and vehicles move between the two countries, according to Statistics Canada and the U.S. Department of Commerce. Roughly 23% of all U.S. vehicle exports are sold to Canadian buyers, a market of 40 million people who purchase about 2 million cars annually. Losing that market would hit U.S. automakers directly, not in theory, but in their quarterly earnings. Analysts at the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association warn that if the U.S. moves production entirely south, costs will rise across the board. Factories in Detroit, Ohio, and Indiana rely on Ontario's steel and components to remain competitive. Tariffs could drive up prices by 10 to 25%, reducing sales and profit margins. And beyond the economics lies a geopolitical cost. Canada supplies the critical minerals, like nickel from Sudbury, that feed America's defense and battery industries. Restricting cooperation risks slowing down both nations' transition to cleaner technologies. If Washington ignores this reality, its own automakers could face declining output, shrinking market share, and backlash from consumers who see higher prices and fewer options. In essence, Trump's attempt to dominate North American manufacturing could isolate U.S. producers in their own market. What began as a power play could become a policy backfire. The confrontation between Ontario and Washington is more than a trade dispute. It's a test of how far economic nationalism can go before it turns inward. By insisting that every car be built on American soil, the Trump administration risks dismantling a supply network that has made North American manufacturing globally competitive. And as Ontario flexes its leverage over energy, minerals, and market access, it becomes clear that no country can dictate terms in a system built on shared prosperity. In trying to make America stronger, Trump's tariffs may instead weaken its industrial foundation. Canada has not caved. Its leaders have shown that partnership is not submission, and cooperation is not weakness. The message from Toronto to Washington is unmistakable. Pressure may win headlines, but interdependence still drives the continent's strength. North America was built on integration, not isolation. And as this new round of tariff battles unfolds, one truth stands out. When one side tries to win everything, both sides start to lose.
On tariffs, the Canadian government is once again playing defense. The U.S.-Canada Trade Minister reassured farmers that no concessions will be made to Canada's dairy quota system after a published report in the Globe and Mail suggested there could be changes.
We have been very clear from the beginning that supply management is not a subject of negotiation with the Americans.
The story of tariffs between the United States and Canada has reached a new flashpoint. Since returning to office, President Donald Trump has turned tariffs into the centerpiece of his economic policy. Duties on steel, aluminum, and autos were only the beginning. By September, new levies landed on softwood lumber, kitchen cabinets, and furniture. The message from Washington was unmistakable: squeeze Ottawa until it concedes. Reports in Canadian media suggested even the most politically sensitive area, Canada's supply management system for dairy and poultry, might be on the table. That system guarantees prices and controls imports, and American exporters have long targeted it. Yet the Canadian government pushed back firmly. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc reminded the public that Parliament passed legislation this summer making supply management off-limits in any trade negotiation. In the face of escalating tariffs, Ottawa has drawn a red line that Trump cannot easily cross. To understand why Canada refuses to budge, it is important to grasp what supply management means. For decades, dairy, egg, and poultry farmers have operated under a quota system that balances domestic demand with production and stabilizes farm incomes. This structure is politically powerful. In provinces like Quebec and Ontario, hundreds of thousands of families rely on it directly or indirectly. In June 2025, Parliament reinforced this system through Bill C-202, a law that explicitly forbids Canadian negotiators from offering concessions on supply management in international trade agreements. This law passed with broad support, reflecting the strong national consensus. In practice, it means Trump's tariffs cannot pry open Canada's dairy sector. Instead of dividing Canadians, Washington's pressure has rallied political parties around a single defense. A tool meant to force compliance has created unity at home, strengthening the very policy the U.S. hoped to weaken. The result is a policy backfire. American tariffs have not broken Canada's will. Instead, they have driven up costs for American industries. The new lumber duties, imposed on September 30, 2025, hit at a time when U.S. housing construction already faces tight supply. Builders now warn of higher prices for homes and slower project timelines. Cabinet and furniture importers are also struggling, with trade associations noting that higher input costs are rippling through retail. On the steel and auto front, manufacturers face higher production costs as North American supply chains are disrupted. Ottawa has made clear it will support affected workers, but the real irony is south of the border. By trying to pressure Canada, Washington has added inflationary stress for American consumers and businesses. Internationally, the stance has also weakened U.S. credibility. Other allies facing similar tariffs are more likely to side with Canada than to accept Trump's framing of reciprocal fairness. In the short term, Canada absorbs real pain from these measures. Mills in British Columbia, factories in Ontario, and auto suppliers across the country are seeing contracts canceled and jobs at risk. Yet the most politically sensitive program, supply management, remains untouched and legally shielded. In the medium term, it is the United States that faces growing domestic opposition. Lumber producers in Canada still find markets, but American builders and consumers pay the price. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce has already warned that reciprocal tariffs could reduce competitiveness and slow growth. With the mandatory review of the USMCA agreement scheduled for 2026, this standoff sets the tone for tense negotiations. What Trump hoped would be leverage has instead hardened resistance. Canada is not abandoning its supply management system, and the U.S. risks isolating itself. A strategy designed to break Ottawa has ended up highlighting the limits of tariff power and the cost of economic confrontation. In the middle of harvest season, farmers in Canada depend on heavy combines that cost millions of dollars and keep their operations alive. For decades, many of those machines came from a factory in Omaha, Nebraska, but this year a major shift occurred.
Claus is one of several companies that has primarily sold to farmers in the prairies. The company has long built its machines in Nebraska, but it's moving its Canadian production to Germany as a strategic response to the current trade climate.
Claus, one of the world's largest combine manufacturers, announced it will no longer produce its Canadian-bound machines in the United States. Instead, production is being moved to Harswinkel, Germany. The reason is not technical, and it is not about product quality. It is about trade policy. By exporting from Germany, Claus can use the Canada-EU trade agreement that eliminates most tariffs. By exporting from the United States, the company would face the uncertainty of new duties. A policy designed to bring production back to America has pushed it away. When President Trump returned to office in 2025, he launched a new wave of tariffs. The White House argued that higher duties would force multinational firms to produce more inside the United States. The goal was to reduce reliance on imports and to create jobs for American workers. Yet the case of Claas shows how the logic is breaking down. Because Canada and the European Union already have a free trade deal, it is cheaper and safer for the company to serve Canadian customers from Germany. According to the European Commission, CETA has cut tariffs on more than 98% of goods between Canada and the EU since 2017. That framework gives a German-made combine a clear advantage over one shipped from Omaha. The contradiction is striking. Shipping a machine across the Atlantic is now more cost-effective than moving it across the border into Saskatoon. Instead of drawing factories into the United States, tariffs are pushing them out.
What's basically happening is firms that have operations in both the US and in Europe are sidestepping the entire issue of tariffs by saying we'll just produce for the Canadian market in a country that doesn't have a tariff dispute.
Experts warn that CLA may be only the beginning. The United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, known as CUSMA, is scheduled for renegotiation in 2026. That uncertainty makes it harder for firms to invest in long-term supply chains. Companies want stable rules, and when they do not find them in America, they look elsewhere. In this environment, Canada quietly benefits. Farmers in Saskatchewan will still get the equipment they need. They will pay prices shaped by European trade preferences rather than American tariffs. Ottawa has not had to spend political capital to achieve this. Instead, it is leveraging existing agreements like CETA and expanding new ones, such as the economic partnership signed with Indonesia in September 2025. By keeping its doors open, Canada positions itself as a steady partner, while the United States becomes less predictable. The contrast is simple. Washington raises barriers while Ottawa finds new pathways.
The move, experts say, may lead to more companies relocating in the future.
And if it's cheaper to send across an ocean rather than send it across a heavily tariffed border, that's what they'll do.
The outcome is a lesson in unintended consequences. The Trump administration promised to restore American manufacturing strength, but the first visible effect is a major company shifting Canadian production to Europe. That means fewer jobs and less investment in Nebraska. It means more confidence for Canada's trading partners and more reliance on agreements that exclude the United States. The pattern could repeat itself in other sectors. Pharmaceuticals, autos, and lumber are already subject to new duties announced in late September 2025. If more firms conclude that it is easier to move production abroad than to navigate a tariff-heavy border, the loss will deepen. What was meant to rebuild America risks hollowing it out. Trade policy is not only about protection. It is about building an environment where businesses can plan with certainty. Without that certainty, the backfire is almost inevitable, and Canada is left collecting the gains.